Good evening. Welcome to the Albany Church of Christ. We're hosting a seminar this weekend. We're excited about it. We're not going to take up a lot of his time. I'm going to ask, we are going to have a prayer before we begin. And right after that prayer, Richard Walker, currently from Nashville, Tennessee, is going to speak to us on creation, myth or miracle. Where does the evidence lead? I believe tonight we're going to be talking about dinosaurs and dragons. So, Ed Healy, would you mind coming up and leading us in a prayer before Richard begins?
Let us pray. Our gracious Father in heaven, we thank you for the many blessings you give us. But most of all, Father, we thank you for the hope that we have of eternal life through Jesus Christ, your Son and our Savior. We pray that you be with the speaker tonight as he talks to us about the evidence leading around the creation and the evidence that we can lock into to give us confidence in our faith. We pray that you bless him with a quick understanding and recollection of his studies. Open our hearts and our minds to receive the truths that are going to be presented. And it's through Jesus we pray. Amen.
And let's see, am I audible back there? Can anybody not hear me? Is it okay? All right. First, let me tell you briefly about who I am. Nobody in particular. I did not grow up in the church. I grew up out in Southern California as an atheist, went to public schools, loved math and science, specifically was interested in evolution a lot as a youngster, had National Geographic, and so got a constant dose of Louis Leakey's work back in the 60s. So I followed evolution quite a bit all the way up through high school and on into college, and considered myself a materialist atheist. I'll mention tomorrow at one point what it is that caused me to change that worldview. But essentially it was recognizing some incompleteness in an atheist worldview, some things it could not explain. I recently had a Chinese PhD that I was grateful to get a chance to spend a little time with, who was considering what's really true. And he's raised in an atheist country. And after we looked at some information, some of the types of things that I'll show, especially tomorrow, about evidence that points toward the necessity of a designer in particular, he said something to me in a way that I don't think I'll ever forget. He said, learning the weakness of naturalism opened my mind to the truth. And he and his wife became Christians. That was part of their process of fully accepting Christianity and the Bible as true. But learning the weaknesses of materialism or naturalism opened my mind to the truth was how he put it. And I thought that's a very interesting way to say that. That's really what happened to me also. But I'll talk more about that later. But just know that's where I'm coming from. Once I began to question materialism and began to question evolution, and specifically began to ask questions in science classes, and I realized looking back on it, I had never really thought critically about the subject. I'd studied it, and I knew a fair amount about it. I know a lot more now after 37 more years, but I was pretty well versed in it. But I'd never really critically challenged it. I'd simply learned more and more and added on top and took what I was taught as true and never really questioned it at all. And the oddity to me looking back is, in the major area I studied was abstract math, and we won't talk about that, so don't worry about that. But one of the main things you do in abstract math is you challenge things. You challenge proofs, you challenge every assertion made, and you check to make sure that a logical argument is absolutely complete, or it's not a valid proof. So here I was in math classes applying that kind of critical thinking skill. That's why I got a degree in, and I was pretty good at that. And then I'd go in my science classes and not challenge anything until after I began to think there's some weakness here in naturalism. And I was astounded when I first asked questions, happened to be in astronomy class, happened to be on stellar evolution, and I asked some questions of a professor, and he could not answer them. He tried to answer the first question. That just made the problem worse. And I asked a follow-up, and I was trying to make him back up. Don't just go forward, tell me we're here, and now here's the next step in the evolution of the star. I wanted him to justify where he was. So I asked him, what preceded that? And he gave me an answer to that, which immediately raised other questions. So I asked a second question. This was in a classroom about the size of this room, a couple hundred students in it, and a guy up on a little podium like this. And I remember him answering the second question, and it just made it worse. And I asked a third question. And I'll never forget this. I really enjoyed the class. The professor just stared at me. And I'll bet you 20 or 30 seconds went by, and that's a long time for just silence like that. He just stares at me. And I was sitting about where my wife is here, about a couple rows back on that side. And then he turns away and goes back to his lecture. And I'm sitting in my chair going, what just happened? I mean, I was shocked. And I wound up talking to students around me. I became rude. I mean, it was not good. By the way, it exposed a character flaw of mine, which was, let's just say I grew up in a home where anger was a way of life, okay? And I actually got angry when I found out I wasn't being told the whole story. And that became motivation to go study more on my own. I've heard other non-Darwinists, in particular, some of you may have heard of a fellow named Michael Behe, who teaches at Lehigh University. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, and he's sort of one of the main players in the intelligent design movement. And I saw an interview with him where he said he was a total Darwinist evolutionist. Here he is teaching at Lehigh. He's a biochemistry professor, I believe. And a couple of students kept challenging him very politely, he said. They wanted him to read a book and answer some, see if he could answer some questions. And he thought they were just a pain in the rear, to be frank with you. But he finally said they were so persistent and they were polite enough that he finally took the book one Friday. So I'm going to read this over the weekend, be done with this Monday, and I won't have to hear any more about it. So he took this book home and he read it over the weekend. And he says in this interview, I'm reading this and realizing these are not trivial questions. These are serious questions that challenge Darwinian evolution. And what stuck in my mind so much was he said, I got angry. He said, how could I have a PhD in biochemistry, be teaching this subject for years at a major university, and be totally unaware of these problems? And so it's not a surprising thing. There's a lot of people who know a lot about evolution, know a lot about science. They've never seen any of these fundamental problems. So try to keep an open mind. And we're going to do something that's hopefully just a little more fun. Tomorrow, we're going to dive into some foundational, some fundamental stuff. I'll try to sort of build a case for you. But what I wanted to show you tonight was something about dragons and dinosaurs. I learned some things in the past year that I didn't know at all about that I thought were rather interesting. And it plays a part in this whole issue because, let's be honest, a Western science-educated person is taught and usually believes the Bible may have some kind of wishy-washy spiritual truths in it, but in terms of talking about reality, the real world, it's just a bunch of mythical nonsense. It has nothing to do with reality, especially creation. It's got nothing to do with that. And a great deal of the Christian church has accepted that view, and they say, oh, those early chapters of Genesis, they're just mythical. That didn't really happen. Okay? So it's a really important subject. And when you look at that issue, it hits a broad spectrum of areas. And what I want to show you a few things about tonight is this notion of something that you've always heard and probably always believed, I know I had, was mythical. And then you go look at some of the actual evidence for this. And it may not be what you expect at all. So that's my reason for doing this. And I hope it serves that purpose, to open your eyes up a little bit. There's some very direct applications to whether evolution is valid or not that come out of this as well. But we're going to talk about dragons. And let me see if I can get this started here, and hopefully we'll have no technical issues. If we do, I'm a software guy, so I can't claim ignorance, but I will anyway. Although I don't have anything to do with that, I don't think. Is there something I'm supposed to turn on? Okay, sorry. There we go. That's what that's for. See, I've got a screen in front of me. I don't know what your problem is. Okay, sorry about that. I should have warmed it up. And as this screen shows up, were dragons real? That's the fundamental question. I mean, I always thought these are just mythical things, just stories people made up. And that's what most people, that's what I thought most people believed. Well, why aren't they real is the question to ask. And to think about why they aren't real, you have to look at what is the evidence for them, if any. And the fact is there's many, many oral and written accounts about these creatures. There's drawings, there's sculptures, there's petroglyphs, there's all kinds of artifacts all over the place. That by itself doesn't prove they're not mythical. It's just a fact they exist. And we'll look at some of who the people are and how they talked about these creatures and some of the specific artifacts. But are all of these accounts just nonsense? Because a lot of the historical accounts, if you go back more than 300 years in particular, especially if you go back that far, the accounts prior to that did not talk about these creatures like myths. They talked about them like everyday creatures. They were journaled by naturalists out in the field documenting the creatures they find. All of a sudden there's dragons listed in there. And they show up in a variety of ways like that. So we want to say, is it really the case that all of these accounts are just nonsense? So you have to look at them. And so that raises a question. Have any mythical creatures really everybody just knew were mythical, have they ever been found? I don't know if you're familiar with any of these. There were stories, one particular group of Indians in New Zealand had these wonderful stories about this giant predatory bird. Okay? Mythical bird. And also, there's stories about giant squid. We're going to look at that. So, Moby Dick, in the book Moby Dick, there's a battle to the death between a whale and a giant squid. But that's just a book, right? But it's in there, and it's a familiar one. I mean, I'm old enough to have seen the old movie with them battling it out. Tennyson's poem has the kraken, this marine monster with giant arms, recently resurrected in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, right? I don't know how many of you have seen that. I love that. I love the kraken in that. That's really fun to watch. So the kraken, that's where that comes from. That's this creature that's been talked about. Jules Verne, when he wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a character in the book, this was not some major point. This is just something that happened in the flow of the book. A naturalist on board the ship notices a creature, and he mentions it because it disgusts him when he sees it. And it's this immense cuttlefish swimming by the ship. Just a passing thing about a naturalist seeing that. And then there are just countless stories from sailors. Of course, those are just drunken sailors, right? I mean, but all kinds of stories about accounts with, encounters with them. Well, you may be surprised to find out that giant squid were actually recognized by science. Back in 1802, this French, and I left it in, malacologist, that's somebody who specializes in mollusks. He actually documented the existence of two specific kinds of giant octopus in his book, which was an encyclopedia on mollusks, basically, a scientific book. And he documented two different creatures. And let's see here. And he claimed the first type, which happened to be called the kraken octopus, it was described by Norwegian sailors and American whalers and by ancient writers like Pliny the Elder. We're going to talk about him a little bit later. He was a well-known historian. He wasn't somebody who wrote sci-fi stories or something. And then a larger one called the colossal octopus, which was supposedly, it attacked a specific vessel at a specific point off the coast of Angola. In fact, this is an artist's rendition recounting the statements about this attack, okay? And the guy talking about this is a scientist. Here's another one that he actually penned himself in 1801. Now, 2003, some of you may have seen this. We found out there are giant squid. And they named this one the colossal squid. You can see the size of that thing laying on the table in front of the examiner there. Any of you hear of this? It's been just in the last 10 years. Been out there a little bit? Let's look a little more closely. That's a great picture where you get an idea just how big this thing is. Well, what do they think it really is? They think that's a juvenile specimen, by the way. It had a body length of about 8 feet. So that big, thick, fat body is about 8 feet long. A total length of about 19 and a half feet. But it's a juvenile. And they estimated that an adult size would have a body, say, 13 feet long, and it would approach 40 feet in total length. So we're talking about a very big creature. And this is, again, just an estimate. We don't have any idea how big they might actually get. We've just begun to learn they even exist. If you look closely at what he's looking at, can you see these little things there? Those are barbs, big, thick, barbed weapons that are on rotating hooks on its tentacles. It doesn't just have suckers, it's got these things. It's a well-armed predator. In fact, notice what this guy says. Oh, you probably can't read it. It says, very, very little is known about this species. And if this is a juvenile, we're dealing with much bigger monsters out there than previously suspected. Okay? So this is a scientist investigating a real creature. This isn't some mythical story here. Very interesting. By the way, they found another one. This is in a museum right now. 2007, it was caught off Antarctica. He got snagged. Some guys were fishing. I forgot what they were fishing for. Deep water fishing in cold water off Antarctica. This monster was on their line, okay? Most fishermen are out there trying to make a living. So what do you think they would normally do with that? They just cut the line. We really don't know how often we might have encountered these things. These guys happened to go to the trouble to boat it and then preserve it. Very unusual, but it did happen. So the other one wasn't an anomaly. It's not a one of. We have no idea how big they get, how many there are, or anything. Okay? So it's supposed to be mythical. There's other evidence. I mentioned the rotating barbs. This I find really interesting because this isn't new. Sperm whales have been seen with these, what we now know are colossal squid beaks, the hard beak of that monster, and the mouth part, in their stomachs. And they also, it says they were scarred with these long, deep lacerations, presumably from fighting the squids. So Moby Dick describing a sperm whale fighting to the death with a giant squid, that's got an absolute foundation in fact. And yet I always thought that this is just a story somebody made up. New Scientist commented, once the stuff of maritime myth, these animals are now firmly part of mainstream science. So the question I posed at the beginning, have any mythical creatures been found alive? It's an absolutely yes. It has happened. Okay? And then this comment, too, from one of the researchers. This is a solid hunk of killing animal. I would not want to be in the water with even a baby one. Now, let's talk about dragons a little bit. 1973, World Book Encyclopedia had this statement in it. The dragons of legend are strangely like actual creatures that have lived in the past. They're much like the great reptiles, referring to dinosaurs, which inhabited the earth long before man is supposed to have appeared on earth. So they were acknowledging that the dragon stories, the descriptions, and these, we'll glance at this. We don't have time to go into detail. Many of the dragon stories are anything but vague. They're extremely specific. Creatures of a specific type, of a specific description, and they vary, and they live in specific places, and they have specific behaviors. I mean, it's very, very specific. But they're much like, strangely like actual creatures, like dinosaurs. That info is no longer in the World Book Encyclopedia. Kind of interesting to wonder why it isn't. And just as a quick aside, The word dinosaur. Sometimes people say, well, if dinosaurs are real, why isn't that word in the Bible? There's a real simple answer. The King James Version, the first major English translation, was 1611, and you don't have the word dinosaur till 1841. So you got a 230-year gap in between, so there's no way the word dinosaur would have been in the King James. It's just not possible. Now, the word dragon is many times. Now, this one is something I didn't know until recently. Carl Sagan flat out admitted dragons are dinosaurs. Okay, no question about it. And those of you who remember Carl Sagan back in his heyday, I mean, a staunch atheist with his Cosmos show, was very visible to the public and was often called the smartest man in the world. He flat acknowledged dinosaurs are dragons. And he set about trying to explain how is it raises this really interesting question. How is it that people knew enough about these creatures that they never saw in his worldview? He's an atheist evolutionist. He firmly believed dinosaurs were extinct, 65 million years before man showed up, okay? So how is it that people could write down stories, could make cave drawings, could make artifacts that accurately represent dinosaurs or dragons? He used the word interchangeably. Interesting question. How did this happen? And he wrote a book to try to explain it. The answer is, I think, the reason why I never heard of this before. It's laughable. The answer from the smartest man in the world was pre-humans witnessed. I'll add inferences to his answer. Pre-humans, our evolutionary ancestors that were scurrying around at the feet of dinosaurs, saw these things, were probably eaten by them, and were so terrified by them that somehow memories of these creatures were impinged literally like into the DNA of this pre-human mammal-type ancestor. And then somehow those memories popped up in humans like children who have scary dreams. That's Carl Sagan's answer, documented in his book, The Dragons of Eden. Okay? Once I learned a bit, and there's more to it when you think about it, we'll talk a little more about this tomorrow. There's other implications that are rather interesting in trying to make his story make any sense. But I can't find anybody who really tries to defend that out there. I don't think it's defendable at all scientifically. Occasionally somebody will reference it in passing, but nobody really tries to defend it. And by the way, there's another story that I'll share with you also. I only know of 2 attempts at all to explain why is it people knew what dragons look like. And as Sagan said, dragons are dinosaurs, so how in the world did that happen? So we'll look at another one later. And this is another interesting thing. Dinosaur fossils and plesiosaur fossils, and I'll show you some examples here, they were called dragons by scientists prior to coining a new word, and that's a typo. It's 1841, not 1941. I don't know if you can see this. This is a book called Untold Secrets of Planet Earth, Dire Dragons. And Vance Nelson wrote this. He's a researcher. He's a creationist researcher. But he spent, if I remember right, 7 years. Every artifact, I'm going to show you some of his pictures. This is a great book, coffee table type book, full of full-page glossy photos, because he went and looked at artifacts. He tracked down locations where there were claims about artifacts that were dinosaur-like. Some of them turned out to not be very good, so he didn't include those. Everything he included, he personally verified, photographed, etc. And I'll share with you a little bit of what's in there. A lot of information I was completely unaware of in this book. Anyway, here is an example. And I hope that you can read this. Up here, these are photographs from a museum of science textbooks. That says, Book of the Great Sea Dragons, Ichthyosaurs and Plesiosaurs. Okay? So scientists they flat out called them dragons. And by the way, they were tied to actual fossils of ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. Okay? And then when they shipped, in the shipping of a plesiosaur or an ichthyosaur, it's literally stamped sea drag for sea dragon. This was from I think it was the Hawkins collection, and it was donated to a museum. So the shipping container said, this is sea dragon. I mean, this is what they were called in the past. That was something else I was completely unaware of. Here's another example. You can see right down there, the stamp, the Hawkins sea dragon. It's this fossil. Okay? They're certainly not called that today. In fact, what I thought was true, and what seems to be the general perception of almost everybody, is that dragons are purely mythical. They're just made-up stories. They have nothing whatsoever to do with dinosaurs or any other creatures that actually ever lived. Is that kind of what most of you thought? That's what I seem to see out there, despite the fact Carl Sagan wrote a book just flat admitting they're the same. That seems to have been forgotten about. And I think his answer just wasn't very satisfying, so it's better to ignore the question, is what I think is really going on. Now, here's another one. This giant eagle, the Maori people in New Zealand, they described it with a wingspan of 10 feet, 3 meters. And we're talking about a good-sized bird here. The Maori legend said it hunted humans. Big predatory bird. And what we now know, there's actually a creature that has now been documented by science, and they call it this Haas eagle, the giant Haas eagle, and they say it hunted 300-pound moas. Moas are these huge ostrich-like birds down in New Zealand. Great big. I mean, I wouldn't even begin to tangle with one of those things. They hunted them. Okay, that's what science says now. Well, if you can hunt a 300-pound moa, you can certainly hunt a human, especially if they're not a particularly large one. So it makes the Maori stories believable. They used CAT scans to compare the nervous systems and sensory organs from these fossils to modern raptors, predatory birds. And here's what so this is what I find interesting, and the subject here is how accurate could an oral record be? We had these oral records, like the Maori legends, they're passed down orally. How accurate might that be about a real creature, even though we thought they were just talking about something mythical? And it describes, based on this new research, that's today's science research, they conclude that the Haas eagle, which is the legendary pukai of the Maori, probably perched high above its hunting grounds, searching for prey, then swooping down and killing them. They describe how they think it would attack from behind in sort of a gliding attack, unlike, say, a falcon, a small predatory bird that's incredibly agile and fast. That just happens to match the Maori legend about how the pukai swooped down on people. I mean, even the behavior they described is matched with what science, how they think this creature must have behaved. And it lends scientific credibility to these ancient stories. So it's just something I want you to have in the back of your mind. This is from the scientific discussion of it. It says this eagle became extinct about 500 years ago, yet such is the power and longevity of the oral record among the Maori people that seemingly accurate accounts about the behaviors of Haas eagle have persisted through the centuries. Well, this is only 500 years, but they're saying these guys still remember exactly what they looked like, how they behaved, etc. It was accurate. And science is now caught up with what the Maoris knew. Something else to remember, first of all, dragons don't depend entirely on oral legend at all. There's a whole bunch of written documentation by major historians and naturalists. But some cultures, their ability to maintain history orally is phenomenally good. I mean, they'll have somebody in a tribe whose purpose is to remember all of their stories. And they know all of them. They don't miss a word. And it's just part of their culture, something we're not used to. We write it down, read it on a computer. I can forget all kinds of stuff, look it up again. That's not how they work. So oral stories can be very accurate. There was actually a legal case. It's kind of funny. There was a legal case in the U.S. between an Indian chief and I've forgotten what his position was. Part of the U.S. government as we were taking lands away from the Indians, part of one of those treaty issues that went on. And it became literally a court battle about who's correct about what this agreement was. And it came down on the side of the Indian chief's oral account being more accurate than the written account of the other side. But just understand, they can be very, very accurate. And this is from PLOS, the Public Library of Science. Their artist rendition of what they think this thing looked like. And that's scurrying around there on the ground. It's a 300-pound moa, probably 6 feet tall at least. Okay? So that's what science is saying about these creatures. So what I wanted to do is show you very quickly. We don't have time to go into this. I don't even want to walk through all of these. I'm just going to show you some slides with specific dragons listed one after another. What was their name? Who recounted them? What did we know? What did they say about it? And we'll highlight a couple of things. But we don't even have time. What I'm wanting you to understand is there's lots of these. And they're not vague and they're not identical. Okay? And some of them are fairly, look at this. This one, sightings recorded from 1584 all the way up to 1926. Some of these claim sightings till quite recently. But there's all of those. This is interesting. Can you think of anything else that has three-clawed? I mean, most dinosaurs, the land dinosaurs tend to have three-clawed and a snake-like body. Look at this one. Sighting reported as recently as 1954. This was first reported in 1614. Some of the details. Several of them talk about dragons being hatched from eggs. Okay? Laying eggs in sand. Some of them are associated with rivers and streams. Some are not. Some are strictly terrestrial. A lot of variation. The more laying eggs. Flying serpents, literally flying serpents, recorded by Flavius Josephus, the Roman historian. He's not a quack. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, in his book Natural History, talked about dragons. Marco Polo, the explorer who wrote down what he discovered in he saw dragons. Okay? He recorded that in his accounts. Herodotus recorded Arabian winged serpents. There's another one from Malaysia, a winged dragon living in the jungle. And then it just keeps going on and on and on. Eastern European ones, Native American ones, all over the place. You can hardly find any place that doesn't have some kind of history of dragons. Okay? But what about legends from long, long ago? Well, okay, you can have recent creatures like the giant squid. I mean, those stories are only, they're recent, last couple of centuries. Even the Maori bird was only 500 years ago. What about creatures that are supposedly extinct for millions of years? What about that? Do we have any evidence of people having knowledge of those kind of creatures, aside from dragons at the moment? This is a fossil. These were found in the hillsides. You typically see them in an exposed hillside, and didn't know what they were for a long time. It was thought they were the root of some plant, some unknown plant. Spiral structures, very characteristic. And they're found vertically, and they thought these are some kind of a root. Okay? They're referred to as devil's corkscrew. But then they found at the bottom of it, notice this little, whoops, back up here again. This little section right here, this is very characteristic. You got this vertical spiraled tube, and then you have this upbuilt structure, and what they found inside one was a fossil. What they're now calling Paleocastor, a prehistoric beaver, an animal. This is an animal's den. It doesn't have anything to do with a plant root. This beaver, this Paleocastor, dug a spiral tunnel and then dug upward, and that was how they created their dens. Okay? So science figured out the mystery of these devil's corkscrews. However, the Lakota Indians had a name for these things. They were very familiar with them. When you translate the name, it means beaver lodges. The Lakota Indians knew these were made by beavers. Okay? Long before modern science caught up to that. Here's the part where it differs from our previous examples. Paleocastor is supposed to have been extinct 25 million years. And yet the Lakota Indians knew all about it. So yeah, we've got examples of people today being aware of creatures that were supposedly extinct for millions of years. So that problem has to be discussed. Yes. How did they see them? That's the question. How did the Lakota Indians know about these things? And the other question that you have to ask, if you're actually thinking critically, like I was not the first part of my education, how good are these dates? Just how good are these dates for things being extinct 25 million years? Have any other extinct creatures ever been found? Any of you hear of the coelacanth? Great big fish. I think I got a picture of that coming up here. It's the first one I remember. Read about it in National Geographic. Supposed to be extinct for about 65 million years from the age of the dinosaurs. Was supposed to be one of the transitional types of fish who were developing legs out of their lobed fins for the transition from aquatic to land creatures. That was the story about coelacanth until we found them alive in 1938. Okay, they got caught in 1938. Well, it turns out that was Western science catching up. They sell them in Indonesian fish markets. Okay, you can eat them. They're still alive, very clearly still alive, and yet the claim is all the fossilized ones, all of those fossils are at least 65 million years old. So even after finding them alive today, there's absolutely no challenge to the dates of those fossils. Okay? And no particular explanation for nothing being fossilized in between. You say, well, it just didn't happen. Okay? The reason for it is it would bring into question the age of dinosaurs also, and it would be a gigantic challenge to the whole theory of evolution. Wollemi pine, there was a pine discovered down in, it was either Australia or New Zealand, I think it was Australia, outside Sydney. And this thing was really amazing when it was first discovered. 150 million years extinct. Okay? And I got a picture coming up. And the tuatara, a lizard that was supposed to be extinct for 135 million years. Now here's the coelacanth fossil, and there's a coelacanth fish. Okay? They're quite alive and well. They're huge, too. I had another picture I couldn't find where somebody had one on a table at a market. It's a great big fish. Here's the Wollemi pine. This is the area where it was found in kind of this little recessed valley. And it doesn't get as big as it used to get, but an awful lot of plants don't get as big as they used to get in the fossil record. You actually could buy them for $100. They were selling them for a few years. I kept wanting to buy one, but I could never waste $100. And they kept this location secret for years. They didn't want anybody to go in there and destroy the location. This was such a huge find. This 150 million year extinct plant that's still alive. That's the tuatara. We've actually known about them since at least 1831. What made it interesting was 30 years later, somebody looked at a skeleton of a tuatara and realized it's identical to this fossilized creature, and yet we believe all those fossils are between 150 and 135 million years ago. So here's another creature that all the fossils are supposed to be 135 million years old plus, and yet the creature is alive today. So can it happen? Absolutely. Has it happened? Yes, repeatedly. So we can't ignore that. Okay? This is in Utah. This is the Kachina Bridge. There's these interesting geologic formations all over Utah. They're a really interesting thing to look at that we simply have no time for at all this weekend. Underneath that bridge on one side is a petroglyph drawn by Indians. You can barely see it there. That's the location of it. This is well known among certain circles. You can sort of see it here. It's hard. In fact, it goes all the way back here. I'll show you a better image in a moment. Everybody who's been to this says it's really hard in a photograph to really see it as well as you see it with the naked eye, because photographs don't show the texture differences as well. And the way these petroglyphs were often made was making pits in the sandstone. That was the technique, and it sort of chisels away the desert varnish, and it gives it a lighter color. You can see it's a lighter color than around it, but it also gives it a different texture. So they're really obvious when you're up close in person. There's a better image using some color filtering, so you can see what this thing looks like. Okay, there's the legs, there's the head, there's the neck, there's the body, here's this big, huge tail. I mean, it literally is referred to as Sinclair because of this old Sinclair oil sign. It looks just like that dinosaur image. Well, what to make of that petroglyph? Okay. Now, there's two approaches that people take, and I'll share both of them with you. And by the way, I forgot to mention this. One thing I will always try to remember to mention is, I will not ever try to tell somebody else what they ought to believe. First of all, nobody could tell me what to believe. And secondly, who am I to tell you or anybody else what they should believe? But I will try to tell you what it is I believe, and more importantly, why I think I believe it. And so that's what I ask of you. Think about what you think you believe, and what are the reasons for it. And for a Christian, the Bible tells us to be prepared to give an answer for the reason for the hope that we have, but to do it in gentleness. So that's what we're trying to do here. That's the purpose. So this is just information for you that you've probably never seen. So here's a petroglyph that looks just like this, or does it? Two answers. One group flat says, and I'll get to this later, one scholar says, yeah, the American Indians made incredibly accurate petroglyphs of dinosaurs. And she tries to explain how it is that happened. But she documents how accurately they do it. And not only are the images accurate, and by the way, these aren't skeletons, these are fleshed out creatures, right? The posture, the proportions, the images are amazingly accurate. The locations, they've actually found fossils of particular dinosaurs by going to the location where the Indian legends said they were, where they lived. So there's an incredible tie there that at least one group of people in science admits and has tried to answer. And I'll tell you what her answer is later. I don't think it'll be tonight, it'll be tomorrow. Then there's another group who tried, and this is more common. I'll bet you within 1 minute I could find 1,000 websites that would tell you that image is not a dinosaur. Okay? That's just nonsense. Another group tries to say there is no such evidence. That's the more common group. The ones who are more scientific actually try to deal with it. I'm going to show you both sides on this particular one. And that's the book I mentioned earlier. That's a great resource. That's really well worth getting. Vance Nelson spent an awful lot of time and did a really good job with that. Here's some other evidence that he examined. This is in Maya, a petroglyph, hadrosaur petroglyph. And what Vance Nelson did is, he knew about these. He wanted to see how accurate are these things. So I told you, he went himself to all these sites all over the world. But he also did something else. Without telling the artists what it was they were doing, he requested specific dinosaurs be drawn from a particular viewpoint and posture. So just give me a perspective on it, okay? Because that makes a huge difference on what something looks like, is what perspective are you looking at it from. So Vance Nelson asked for artist renditions of particular dinosaurs from a particular perspective. And he then, in his book, he compares those. I'll show you just a couple of them. There's a whole bunch of them in there. This is a really interesting petroglyph down here, this Mayan one. The way they got these pictures, these are actually carved into the ground. And this photograph was taken by a long exposure camera shot while a light traced out the image on the ground. There's several of them. There's not just one. There's a whole bunch of them right in this area. So that's how they got this picture, so you can really see it much more clearly. That is one of the real interesting petroglyph, and that's a particular hadrosaur drawn in the same posture. Okay? Looks rather similar. There's a mural. This is something else that's interesting. The Mayans and some other cultures, they seem to like really fancy hats. And the things they put on their hats are kind of interesting. It's, creatures. It's not feathers, it's creatures. And in this ruin, there's this mural, and on the mural are a bunch of cases up here. And many of these people have fancy headdresses. There's a rabbit, a rabbit head. It's just the head of a creature put onto a hat, and a person's wearing it. Okay? Several of them are just regular old animals like a rabbit. Then there's this one. Here's a blow-up of it. Okay? There's a dinosaur in the same perspective and posture. Okay? So a very accurate drawing there. This one, Bishop Bell, I think it's Richard Bell. I probably got the details of when he died. Several hundred years ago. His tomb, I could probably have it right here in front of me. Yeah, he died in 1496, and this is in the foundation of the Carlisle Cathedral. Okay, he's buried in the floor of the Carlisle Cathedral, and his tomb is decorated. There's a metal engraving around the edge of the tomb, and it was covered for centuries by this heavy rug. And fairly recently, somebody took a close look at Bishop Bell's tomb, And I've read people that have gone over there and they said, you know, if you're lucky, you get the right person, sometimes they'll roll the rug back and let you look at it. But it's rare. There's a number of just regular old animals carved into this metal rim around this tomb. And then there's this one. Okay? 2 long-necked creatures, and they're not identical. I hadn't noticed this before. There are actually some differences between them. And so Vance Nelson took a close look up at the one on the left, and notice its tail has got some spikes on it. The other one does not. So again, particular dinosaurs. Shunosaurus has a tail like that. From this perspective, you only see the 2 horns. You don't see the other one. It's behind one of them. Perspective matters. And it looks a whole lot. This creature looks, oh, look at that. I mean, look at the proportion of the back legs to front legs, the long neck, the spiked tail, all of it. I mean, it's a very, very good match for that creature. The other one is different. No spikes, different proportioned head, different dinosaur. But there's another one that, again, matches it extremely well. Notice less difference in the leg length on this one than the previous one. These aren't the same, but they actually match particular, specific dinosaurs. How did that get carved in the 1400s on Bishop Bell's tomb if man never saw these creatures? I told you what Carl Sagan's answer is. Okay? By the way, I elaborate a little bit. Not only did people have these terrifying dreams, these memories coming up out of their, I don't know what, their genetic history, but they were so vivid that people believed they had these encounters. So they're almost like a hallucination or something. That's how vivid these dreams are supposed to be. So I guess he would say, well, somebody thought they saw these 2 dinosaurs in that posture, and so they carved it on there. That's one answer from science. Not a very good one. This is in Cambodia, or Angkor. Yeah, in Cambodia. There's a temple monastery down there. All kinds of carvings all over these monasteries. Carved one. There's a real interesting one right here. That's a close-up of it. Does it remind anybody of anything? Looks a whole lot like a Stegosaurus. Just another interesting piece of data. How did they know about that? Whoops. Yeah, let me back up here. Now I want to talk, you have to go briefly over a few things here. We've looked at artifacts, okay? Now what I want to talk about is historical accounts very quickly. And there's lots of them, many of them, and they're very specific. First, the Chinese calendar I always find interesting. 12 creatures, 11 plain old normal ones, and dragons. Anybody ever think about that? I mean, they don't have leprechauns or unicorns or medusas or any other mythical creatures in there. They got 11 regular old normal creatures and dragons. And Chinese have all kinds of stories in their history about dragons, all kinds of sculptures, accounts of them breeding them. Marco Polo recounts seeing dragons in China when he visited China. Lots and lots of historical information there. By the way, snakes and dragons are not the same, and they make, you have snake and dragon both in that Chinese calendar. I mentioned Flavius Josephus, his recounting of dragons. I mean, he's referred to as one of the 5 greatest Hellenic historians. Not a crackpot. Pliny the Elder, he wrote that natural history. That was considered a model for all encyclopedias, a systematic laying down of information. Herodotus, the father of history, Cicero called him that, first systematic historian. He wrote about dragons. And then, of course, Marco Polo. So these aren't just, Aunt Betty wrote it on the back of a letter while she was drinking. It's not those kind of accounts, okay? They're very, very different than that. And I really don't have time to go through much of this. Herodotus, he wrote about winged serpents. I do want to tell you this little bit, though. He heard about a story near the city of Buto in Arabia. So what did he do? He's a historian. He goes to investigate, okay? He went to investigate, and he wrote that he saw flying reptiles in quantities impossible to describe when he went to the location that claimed this is what was there. And he said, the form of the serpent is like that of a water snake, but he has wings without feathers and as like as possible to the wings of a bat. This is what Herodotus wrote when he went and examined these stories. There's a bat. There's a model of a pterosaur. Okay, we know of winged creatures that don't have feathers. Okay, besides bats, all kinds of pterosaurs also. And there's many types of dragons. Land-bound carnivores like the various raptors and T-Rex, flying creatures with bat-like wings, like we just looked at several of those, lots of those around. Pterosaurs are interesting. They're supposedly been extinct since the age of the dinosaurs, and they got rather big. Got an interesting picture of this guy coming up, a wingspan of 33 to 36 feet. That's big if you picture it. I don't know how wide this building is. We got 50 feet here in width maybe, something like that, or 60 at most. I mean, this is 6 feet, so 6 times this, okay? You're going to cover the majority of this room. That's the wingspan of one of these creatures. Here's a picture of one. That part is to scale with a human, an adult human, okay? So if people actually saw these, or per Sagan, if they're dredging up dreams from their pre-human evolutionary history, yeah, you could see where you would have stories about them hunting men. I mean, they're a lot bigger than man. Here's a petroglyph. Look at the head part. It's even got the crest on the top of the head, just like this particular pterosaur does. So lots and lots of information like that. This last little one here, see that little image? There's a close-up. What does that look like? A fire-breathing dragon, right? Now, wait a minute. We're going to get to fire-breathing? Several of the accounts include fire-breathing dragons, okay, including the Bible in the book of Job. Leviathan is flat out described. If you just take what it says, just read it as plain old language, it's a fire-breathing dragon. No way to get around it. And then I love, read the footnotes. Pick up your favorite study Bible and see what the commentators tell you that creature is. Anybody know what the most common one is? Crocodile. Yeah, people are terrified of crocodiles. We don't dare touch one like Job. I mean, just read that account and then look at what's said. The reason the commentators say that is because it's simply not possible that could be a description of a real creature, a dragon, like it's described, a dinosaur, a fire-breathing dragon. Tomorrow, we're going to look at this issue of breathing fire. We're going to look at some rather amazing creatures that we know of, and we're going to build a case for, is it possible you could have a living creature, a biological creature that could breathe fire? Okay? And that's one of the things we're going to talk about tomorrow. Pretty interesting. One last one, you can sort of see this here, 3 horns. Is that a Triceratops? Another interesting petroglyph. And let's see here. And I'll just get to one more. Because this is on a church, the Church of St. Louis of the French. It's called the Church of St. Louis of the French in Rome. This was completed in the 1580s. Okay? What do you think that is? I mean, that looks to me like a fire-breathing dragon again, carved into this church. So were they carving mythical creatures into it? Or is there any possibility that something like that might actually ever have existed? I believe absolutely possible. In fact, plausible. But that's what I believe. I'll present reasons why I believe that as part of what we're going to do tomorrow. And that's all I have time to present tonight. I wanted to use this one, as I said, to get across the idea that we need to even challenge, if we're really going to be skeptical at all, we really need to challenge even things like, just because I'm told something is a myth, does that mean it's not possibly true? That has big implications in the issue of, is it possible the Bible's actually true? Since it's treated as mythical very often. So it's an important subject. And I will hang around for some question and answer. In fact, if we could entertain a few now while we have a few minutes. So if anybody has any questions, please let me know.